Welcome back, everyone, to the next episode of the Let Nothing Move You podcast. I'm your host, Christian Ashley, as we continue on through the book of Exodus. Today, being in Exodus 19 with a guest host, but we're not going to talk about him right now. We have other guest hosts. We have other guest hosts to prepare for. That, of course, being Pastor Will Rose of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church and Chapel Hill will be with us for the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. Then I'm going to have Karai Rowe of the Foreign Saints podcast join me for 21 and 22, and later on for 28 and 29. But today, you know him. I struggle to say the words, you might love him.
Tolerate.
But, I mean, tolerate is a perfect example of the word. A co-host of the Whole Church podcast, Systematic Ecology, and the host of the most infuriating show on the NSL Ministries Network. Dummy for Theology. I have Joshua Knoll. How's it going, Joshua?
Let's go, man. I'm excited. I'm about to record episode 2 in season 2 of Dummy for Theology later today. And that first episode of season 2, I feel like I didn't quite figure out what the format should be for this season, but I think I got it figured out. So episode 2 might be a little bit better, but still infuriating for you. This time we're talking about slippery slopes.
Ooh.
Yeah, I have a whole segment on Al Mohler in this episode, so you should love that.
Oh, excellent. I look forward to everyone that releases when they do, whenever you have the time. I'm glad this is a vehicle for you to speak on the things that are on your mind. That's why I do the Why I Don't Like podcast too, because sometimes I just got to talk about why I don't like things. Sometimes you got to talk about logical fallacies. That's why we work well together.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, man. I just got to say, this is like the John the Baptist episode of Exodus, where instead of John the Baptist preparing for Jesus, I'm here to help you all prepare for Will Rose. Yeah, it's going to be a big one.
A voice calling out the wilderness so that Will Rose could be heard and appreciated. Yeah. I like it.
Yeah.
Especially since I'm recording a lot of these out of sequence. I think this one it will be in sequence, but then others are going to be all over the place. They're not going to know it unless I say something. But yeah,
that's funny. Yeah, and Will is actually my pastor, so I'm actually a member of his church. So this is fitting.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. What do you say we get into this bad boy?
We don't have to.
Oh yeah, we could just talk for the rest of the time. Just have the name.
Let's just talk about Will Rose.
Yeah, but we don't talk about it the entire runtime.
Perfect.
When are they going to get to it?
30 minutes of Will Rose is the coolest bald surfer I know. Screw Silver Surfer.
The Silver Surfer, Norrin Rad wishes he was Will Rose.
Yeah. When the Marvel Comics write about how Silver Surfer glistens in the sun, they also forgot there was a side note that said, but he still pales in comparison to the real surfer, Will Rose. Yeah.
What was it you said when you met him in person for the first time about his head?
It was, I don't remember if I said it was more round or less round. I forget. It was shaped different. I think it was more round in person.
Wow.
I also do realize that whenever I podcast, these videos don't get published, do they?
No.
That's unfortunate. For some reason, whenever I podcast with people, I think it's just because in my head, you're all so cool. Whenever I see people, and you being the exception because I saw you in person before we podcasted. Whenever I see someone I've podcasted with before in person, I've discovered I always expect them to be significantly taller than me. Like in my mind, they're just so much grander than I am. I'm like, I'm waiting to see Will Rose. And I'm like, in my head, he's like 8 feet tall. Goliath in person, the pastor.
It's so much grander than me. Am I going to have that moment when Nick and I meet up in August in just 2 weeks from now from this recording?
I hope so.
Like, oh man, was Nick really like 5'1" and 100 pounds sopping wet?
Nah, he is 10 feet tall and
a very muscular specimen of a man.
Yeah.
The one you want to protect you.
His bicep alone is 200 pounds. Yeah. I think we should probably get to the other.
We've derailed for almost 5 minutes. Let's just get into Exodus 19, verses 1 through 6. And as usual, I'll be reading through the ESV, not because I think it's the best translation, but it's because what I use for most of my classes, so it's just easier that way for me. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. Joshua, take it away.
I feel like we should have done some like background work before getting into the chapter, because last time I was on, we were in a much more disagreeable situation. It's like a lot of your Genesis, especially up through probably till after Noah, in my mind, is all mythology. It's all like a good story to tell us good truths, but didn't literally happen. And we have a lot of disagreements around that. I think we have some disagreements around like who wrote this. I obviously do not think it's Moses. In my mind, that's crazy people thoughts. And in your mind, not thinking that is crazy people thoughts. So we're there. But I think what's interesting, so I tend to think that this chapter was probably written by the help me out here. You can't help me out here.
Ezra.
The P source. So the documentary hypothesis, you got your YEPD. Am I missing one?
The Elohist.
I think that's it.
I should know these things.
So just to help people out a little bit, documentary hypothesis isn't like, hey, we think 4 or 5 people wrote all of this. We think there's a bunch of different sources that kind of came together. Usually they'll say one redactor came in. I think the smartest people, like Richard Elliott Friedman, will argue that the redactor was Ezra, who came in later, because if you read in the biblical text later in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra, it says when Ezra presented the word of the Lord, no one had ever heard it like that before. So there's a lot of textual clues that suggest maybe Ezra kind of put the Torah together, maybe. And again, Christian is like wanting to reach through the screen and smack me.
That's every day.
Yeah. But I mean, even when you go through these first 4 or 5 books, you'll see a lot of the same stories told over and over with a little bit of differences. You'll see some of the stories kind of out of order and things that just don't quite line up. So that's where I'm like, it would be weird to me to think one person wrote all this, because why is he so incoherent? Was it just a dumb person wrote all this? To me, it just doesn't make sense. So I feel like there's a lot of in text. This is very obviously more than one person wrote this. But when we get to Exodus, I'm thinking most of these stories were all probably the same author, because they're very much in sequence. So I'll still attribute this to, and I promise there's a point to all this.
Yes.
The priestly source. So in my mind, and some of this comes from Friedman, he takes a little bit further than I would, that a lot of this was probably written by the priestly source, aka the Levite tribe. So you're going to see strong emphasis on Aaron. You're going to see a strong emphasis on the Levites and the priestly people. And you do see some of that in this chapter, I think, highlighted pretty strongly. And, it's not going to be the priestly source throughout all of Exodus, but I think a lot of it. When you get to Leviticus, which I hope I guessed a lot on, pretty much all of that is priestly source. So looking at this, it appears as though what's so interesting is, we're thinking of the priest writing this. Sinai is a big thing for the people of Israel. This is a big moment. This is like, you got to think, there's no Jesus, there's no cross, there's no 10 commandments. What is their symbol? The symbol of their religion is Mount Sinai. So I think it's so interesting that this chapter opens up. And where do they find Sinai? You would expect, in my mind, it like there's a land of milk and honey flowing from the heavens, like something crazy. And it goes in the wilderness, 3 different times. It's like, all right, dude, I get it. It's in the wilderness, but I think the point is, maybe where you least expect it, that's where you find the place you're going to meet with God. And I think that's such a powerful opening statement for what we're going to read here. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I needed to have been writing down notes to counter some of your claims, because there was like 4 or 5 times I wanted to speak. I might remember one of them.
Sorry about the rant.
I knew what I was getting into when I invited you on. And of course, you are more than welcome to come back for Leviticus. As I do
the whole book. Here we go.
I don't know if I can take that.
We'll just do a 40-hour episode.
Yeah. I think, remembering your point about Ezra, I can't remember the exact verse off the top of my head, but it had the people never heard it before. Well, to me, that's because they'd been in exile for decades and had never had the Holy Scriptures with them on their persons. They weren't exactly the most pious of people when they left. So why would they have the scrolls and everything written down in their presence? It's probably just left behind in Israel or taken by Jeremiah or someone else. So go ahead.
Two things with that. One, yeah, there's definitely multiple ways of reading that. I don't want to say like my way is the only way. My counter, though, to that would be we see Daniel, we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There still was clearly a remnant of people who knew the scriptures, though it seems to be suggesting parts of what Ezra read no one had heard before, which, again, still wouldn't make sense because how would Ezra know about it? That's a whole thing. But I think there's room for interpretation in that. So I don't think my way is the only way. But
fair enough. Right. Yes. But then I kind of want to challenge you on the whole mythology section. Is why would your priests want to create a mythology based on a lie for what's going on? How can they have a precedent for why they are able to do what they're able to do then if it's based on a lie?
Well, I don't know that the priests, I think priests probably didn't write most of the mythology part, but also that's not a lie. That's just how mythology is used. I mean, in every culture, that's how mythology. I mean, that's how the Greek used their mythology. It's not that they thought literally this is what happened. You look at the Greeks; they had multiple different mythology stories to tell different points with different meanings, and that's what we have in Genesis, right? You see, Genesis 1 and 2 are completely different stories. The order happens differently. You know, God made man and woman at the same time in Genesis 1, and then Genesis 2, God's like, "I'll make man, and then later I'll make the creatures, and then later I'll make woman." Like, to me, and I know the right, the more conservative way of interpreting it is just an expansion or an explaining of what happened in one. But to me, there's just too much inconsistency. So it feels like the reader's not meant to think that this happened, or else it would have been said a little bit more coherently. I think it was meant to show these are stories with moral meaning that we should take something out of and apply to our lives.
Nowhere through these it says, hey, this is a parable. Hey, this is what you think might happen. This is portrayed as history.
No, it's not, though. Most parables don't start with, hey, this is a parable. Most fiction stories don't start with, this is a fiction story. It will start with like once upon a time or something. And you have a lot of that kind of wording in those first few chapters. And again, like it just like you got to think of the time and place. Like the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, none of them started their mythology stories with, hey, guys, this isn't real. Well, it's pretty clear they didn't think that one of these stories was right and the others were wrong.
I think the main difference being who their God was versus who their gods were versus God, and God being an author of truth, and his priesthood being based on a mythology versus reality is a huge detriment to the entire movement.
That is why a lot of people take your stance. I think there's good philosophical reason to take your stance. I don't think there's good textual reason. And for me, and I think that's the big difference, is I'm just like, if I'm looking at the text as it is, I can't look at this and go, oh yeah, someone meant for us to think this was history. I mean, it's written as poetry for chapter 1. It's written as, parable for chapter 2. And like, they just changed the genre. They changed the story. It's, I don't know. It doesn't quite fit for me. And you also got to think the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, they didn't think their gods were gods of lies. They thought their gods were gods of truth too. So I don't know. I do see where you're coming from. I don't think it's a bad position. I just disagree.
Well, you know what the good news is?
We can disagree.
We can disagree.
I think
the good news is I still think you love God, and I still think you love your neighbor as yourself.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and the big thing, too, if we're just thinking of like Genesis up through Noah, we might come to different points because we think there's different context it was written in. And I think we talked about that before, like with Joseph. I'm looking at it like, okay, this is written to people who were exiled in Babylon. And what's it saying to people who are exiled like that? And you're looking at people who are in the wilderness looking for truth. So we're going to see, because we have a different audience in mind that we think it was written to, a little bit of difference in why it was written. But at the end of the day, I read Genesis 1 and I go, wow, God is a powerful, almighty God who cares deeply about his creation and has a special significance on humans. And you read it and come away with a lot of the same points. We just think differently on whether it happened historically, and really, who cares?
God does. But I agree to the extent of I also wasn't there. As we've stated multiple times, I wasn't there watching the world be formed. Was it 6 literal days? Was there a gap in between the times? Was it literally 24 hours?
Oh,
Who
yeah.
knows?
We both
Who
do agree
knows?
that gap theory is dumb, though. That's just silly.
Nah, I'm either day, age, or gap theory, depending on my feelings
Okay,
at the time.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I
It's one
didn't
of
mean to
those
make fun of your potential
no. Do that. As long as we can agree that, oh gosh, what's that stupid one I talked about on my seminary life? The
Day
apparent
age?
age.
Oh.
No, apparent age. As long as we can both agree that deserves to be shot behind a barn, I'm fine.
Okay. I can even deal with day age. I do think, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but to me, I feel like if you're going to take it literally, you do got to be a little bit creative. Like you either have to be creative or deny evolution. Whereas mine, I'm like, oh man, that was a cool story. I don't have to do all that.
I will be the first one to say my side takes more work and finagling to do, and I'm okay with that because I'm
lazy. That's the real, real point of all this.
That's why I am the superior follower of Christ.
Yeah, I'm on the couch like, Jesus, that was a good one. Tell me another story.
No, listen, I don't actually think that.
Tell me Daniel next. That's a great work of fiction.
Yes, Daniel, my favorite historical book in the Bible. It's not even that. I'm just saying that to piss you off.
I just think it's so funny. We need to do like a Daniel versus series. When you get to Daniel, it's just like I take a break from my show and we just once a week have verses.
I would find that a very challenging and rewarding experience.
Be pretty funny.
But to get back to what we're actually supposed to be talking about.
Yes, Sinai in the wilderness is super significant and really cool.
Yes, we can agree on that. So, based on the historical narrative, it has been.
I mean, I think this part is mostly historical.
Oh, okay. Only mostly historical.
Well, there's a difference of history and history told through religious eyes because you're making different points, but it's still history. You're just emphasizing things differently. I would be okay with, I'm not sure, but I would be okay with finding out one day that there wasn't really a cloud. That was just imagery used to make a point about this moment in history. I'd be okay with that. I don't think that's true, but I'd be okay with it.
Okay.
It wouldn't hurt my interpretation.
So if you're following along with the people's movements, it's been about 3 months for the people of Israel to get to Mount Sinai. A journey that at worst should have taken about a week. But as we've seen, God has directed them in various different locations to test them. And Israel has continually failed the tests offered to them. So that's why they haven't gotten there until now. And this is God preparing them for a momentous occasion in that they're about to be staying in this location for almost an entire year. And biblically, they're not going to leave the area until Numbers 10, verse 11. So think of the huge gap of time we would think would happen there in that we're here at Exodus 19, and they don't leave until Numbers 10. That's an entire book in between there. That's the rest of Exodus and the first 10 chapters of Numbers. I kind of think we should be focusing on what is God saying through those chapters if he's having the people stay there that long.
Sorry, I'm not trying to go off on a tangent, but I think this is significant. My dad told a story to me once that I really like going back to this story. And it was a pastor started at a church, new to him, not a new church, but new to him. Congregation has gone through many pastors before or whatever, but he gets up, he starts to tell a sermon, and he preaches on John 3:16. At the end, everyone's like, oh, hey, man, great sermon, whatever. So then next week, what he comes? He preaches John 3:16. Like, hey, that's what you did last week, but that was a good point you made, whatever. Third week, when are you going to stop preaching John 3:16? It's like when you start getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might be what God's doing here. He's like, hey, y'all can move when you get it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's only been 3 months, and they've almost been rebellious 3 to 4 times since they left Egypt. Like, no wonder he's taking his time with these people. And this is him knowing in advance they're about to break things off and him have to curse them to wander for 40 years. That hasn't happened yet. And yet he's still taking time to pour into them so that they understand, hey, when you do these things against me, there are consequences. And yet the lesson doesn't really sink in. And I really can't say anything too much about what I would have done in that scenario.
Yeah. Well, I also think, and I think this is really like the theme of the chapter. That's why I wanted to be on. And it's not just preparing for Will Rose. I think it's just about preparations. Here we're preparing for the word of the Lord. And that's not something you just, okay, let me crack open my Bible real quick. Boom, there's the word of the Lord. Yes, the Bible is the word of the Lord, but there's more to it. Like, you have to be ready to hear God. You're not just going to, God's not just going to stop you where you're at and be like, hey, I got a couple things I need to say to you real quick while you're in the store. Like, okay. But also, God isn't going to send you until he knows you're equipped. Mm-hmm. So if God has called Christian, because I know he has not called me to be a head pastor, he's not going to put Christian at a church as the pastor, knowing that right now you might struggle with temptations in this area, or you don't quite understand finances well enough, and the church is going to go under, and you will fail. You are going to have failings.
Yes,
but God's going to make sure you have what you need, that you don't have to fail before you go. He's not going to send you somewhere. God's not out there like, watch this, I'm going to set him up. That is not God. Even with Job, also not a historical work. Even with Job, though, one of the interesting things in the story is that no matter how many times the accuser, Satan, whatever you want to call him, is like, hey, I'm going to do this to Job. Let's see if he'll really follow you here. I'll see if he'll really do this. God always has limits, because he's like, I'm not going to put Job where he can't succeed. I'll let you put him through hell, but I'm not going to let you put him through something that he can't come out of.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with that point. And continuing on here, we are at Mount Sinai. And this is, as we've mentioned before, one of the most historic parts of Israeli history. Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, is where Moses had received the good word from the burning bush that he was to work with God to lead his people out of slavery. Now God is going to do another mighty work with Moses, revealing the law to him and the people over the next few months, which gives them the chance, so we've talked to you about, working on their holiness and their relationship with him. And it is also here that Israel is first called a kingdom of priests. Go ahead, Joshua.
Kingdom of priests is excellent. So before we get to that, just because this is like my Bible nerdy podcast that I like to listen to. So I want to hear you say, what mountain do you think Mount Sinai is? Because there's so many debates around this, because I think part of like why it's worded wilderness is like it gives you enough hints that I think the author intended people to know what mountain he was talking about.
Yes.
But we do not know.
I think given the historical cultural context of the time when this was written, people would have known. Now, I can only guess because there's mountains in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. I have no clue whatsoever. There's Arabic names that they have now I could fail to pronounce and make everyone angry. So that's something that would bear more research on my end before I actually said, that's exactly where it is.
Well, let's commit now to your audience that you and I are going to go on an expedition, the Let Nothing Move You expedition, where we go to all of these different mountains, all of them, and the Sinai Peninsula, and we just say, "What up, God?" until He responds, and we are moved.
Okay,
and then we'll document
until we get to the point where someone commands us to take our sandals off.
Yeah.
Then we'll know that's the right mountain.
Correct.
All right. Well, if my 10 listeners and your 20 listeners can pool their resources together to send us both to a war-torn region right now, well, actually, Sinai's not that bad. We can do this. I believe in you, listeners, that you can fund this stupid expedition.
Do it.
Two American podcasters die in the middle of the wilderness trying to retrace the steps of the Israelites.
When I die, my only request is, since I grew up in Florida, I want my death head title to be Florida Man Dies in.
Agreed. We'll make the contract right now. This is a verbal contract. It has to be fulfilled when we inevitably die on our stupid mission we just decided to do.
Florida Man and North Carolina podcaster both died.
So yeah, my answer is I don't know.
Sorry.
I would tend to go in like the middle of the peninsula if I remember my maps correctly. I don't have one in front of me, but I can't take a bullet for that.
Well, say one name so that later when I listen to this, I can look it up and be like, I think Christian's crazy, because I like doing that.
Well, I also don't have the list of mountains in front of me in the chain.
That's one of my favorite pastimes is looking up things you say.
Excellent. I'm glad I have a critic like you. It keeps me honest.
Well, it's so this is one of those, like, and we were talking about this on the Whole Church podcast the other day, but it's one of those things that, like, the stuff you think of are stuff that I would never think of, because I'm like, for me, I'm like, is this real? Is it historic? What is the point of this thing? And you're like, hey, it's definitely real. So let's think about what really happened. So you bring up questions I would never think of. So It's fun for me to look into them because I wouldn't on my own.
See, this is how we keep each other honest.
It's great.
But, yeah. We provide more work for each other.
Yeah. Listen to Let Nothing Move You. It'll give you more to do.
There you go. That's a stunning advertisement for the show. So last thing, and that's where we'll move on, is that, like I said earlier, this is where Israel's first called a kingdom of priests. And this declaration by God wasn't intended to mean that they are now all priests. No, there's a specific branch, the Levites and Aaron and his sons, that are for that role. But it was a sign of their further being set apart as a holy people against every other tribe and nation in the world. Only the people of Israel had received God as their primary provider and caretaker in this way. And only they would be the ones through whom the world would be blessed. It didn't happen, for the Khmer. It didn't happen for the Rus. It didn't happen for the Lakota. It happened for the Israelites. And this kingdom of priests was meant to be a light in the world that showcased the glory, power, and love of God. But it was a conditional gift, one that required them to be faithful to him. And it is because of their unfortunate eventual apostasy that Christians, both Jew and Gentile, are now that kingdom of priests, who now bless his chosen children in this new kingdom. And as Peter says in 1 Peter 2:9, I'm going to use the NLT for this translation, he says, "But you are not like that, people who don't believe God, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own profession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light." Him using a verse like this helps bridge that gap of helping to understand what our role is now. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just waiting until you were done. That was good stuff.
Thanks.
First off, I think it's pronounced a geekdom of priest. But I was actually going to ask you, do you know, were the Levites and priesthood set up before this point?
This is where they're getting set up.
Okay. So I do wonder, sorry, I wish I knew this off the top of my head, because I remember I was reading some up preparing for the episode too, and I never quite got any clarity on this, but it makes me curious if whether or not God's initial plan was for everyone to be priests. And then after some screw ups and some questionings and stuff that we see, God was like, okay, I got to structure this differently because you guys did not obey my original plan. Because I mean, especially if you look at like the book of Esther, like God always seems to have, here's what would be the best plan for you guys, and then here's what's actually going to happen. It's like a backup plan, but he knows the backup plan is going to be what really happens.
I agree with that. His whole thing is like, hey, here's what I want to happen. Here's what I want you to do. But knowing who you are, here's what's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
And then in regards to your questions about the Levites, I think in the next couple of chapters before the golden calf, that system is starting to be put in place. I can't say that 100%. I don't remember that part, number one, because it's, to be perfectly honest, not my favorite part of scripture. But yeah, I can't definitively say right here without reading ahead, that's exactly what happens. But okay. I think for sure, like he at least sets up like the priestly garments and stuff like that. So that to me, without looking at anything else, proposes the Levites are there.
So my headcanon is God did want everyone to be priests. And then we'll see what happens. Dun, dun, dun. To be continued. Dun, dun, dun.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I expect that 22-page paper on my desk in the morning. No, I don't know, way off track, but who cares? I just had to do a paper for my apologetics class, and I was about ready to blow my brains out.
But you actually had to take an apologetics class. That's good.
Yeah, I'm grateful for it. I love my professor. That's the worst part. I wish I could hate him. I wish I could say I don't like this man. I just hate what he makes me do.
I know a lot of seminaries don't make you take that anymore, which I think is sad.
Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah, hearing Brandon talk about that earlier on my seminary life was like, what foolish decision was that?
Yeah, that seems silly. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So we can move on to the rest of this chapter. We'll be in verses 7 through 15. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain, or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. The wording in Hebrew kind of implies with an arrow. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. What do you think?
Oh, man. We were talking about this earlier. This part of what makes this difficult. I've preached on Exodus 19, 10 through 20 before. I haven't preached a lot. This is one of the few things I have preached. So I'm pretty passionate about part of the section that we read here and part of the next section. And I'm trying to figure out what to say when. So there's two big things I like to hit on, because I've preached on this once and I've taught it a couple times. My favorite time teaching it, actually, this is side tangent, but it was part of a Bible study we did, The Road to Revelation, and reading all the parts of the Bible you need to understand Revelation, because contrary to a lot of people, I don't think you could just read it and be like, oh, I know what this means now. I think especially Revelation is like Marvel's Endgame, and it's just constant reference and characters, and you're like, wait a minute, who's that? What's going on here? And if you don't know your scripture, it's just kind of random babbling. Yeah. And that's why so many people have crazy interpretations of Revelation, because they don't read the rest of the Bible first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry. Same tangent. But
yeah.
Sinai is really important to Revelation. That's just, that's a thing. But so I mentioned before, I think this chapter is largely about preparing. What does it mean to prepare to hear God? In your life, in church, whatever. And then also, I think you see, and I don't think this is part of the point, I think it's just really displayed well here, that our worship, God himself, us as beings, need to be thought of as both something physical and something spiritual. So I don't remember if it's in this section or the next section, when it talks about God as lightning and thunder, his presence.
That's about to come up.
Okay. So I'll start with with this then. So we see here the commands to the people to prepare for the word of the Lord is both this physical and the spiritual thing. So they are both, they're washing their clothes. They're refraining from sexual intercourse during this time. And also they're having to pray, right? They're having to be blessed and anointed. So there's the spiritual and the physical elements. Of course, this also goes to sacramental theology, sacramental thought. This is where I like a lot of high liturgical stuff, because I think, the Eucharist, Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it, baptism, marriage, holy orders. I think all of these do play an important role. I mean, even the service itself, the church service itself, can play an important role of physically embodying what we are spiritually doing and participating in. That doesn't mean I think everyone needs to go buy nice fancy suits or anything like that. But I come as you are. I love that. But I also think there is something meaningful of, hey, taking a shower, shaving, putting your best foot forward, not because you have to, or you'll be shamed, or because God requires this of you, but rather because you're preparing for the one who is the most clean, the one who is the most holy, the one who is most separate. So doing something ourselves to prepare ourselves to be in that mindset, to hear from the divine, I think it's meaningful and important, not because the divine requires it of us, but rather it softens us up. It prepares us. It prepares our ears to hear what we need to hear. So again, I can't stress enough, God does not require that of you. You can be, again, in the wilderness. You can be anywhere and just stop, and God will talk to you. But I think there is also something important and special, spiritual even, about physically putting your best foot forward, going somewhere, prepared to hear the word of the Lord. I think we can't overstress the importance of that. And I think that's a lot of what this has to do with. And, there's the physical, I'm restraining from sex, but there's also, like, we know now, especially with the study of biology and stuff, they didn't know them when they wrote this, but a lot of this stuff does do psychological work on you, right? Taking a shower changes your mind state. You feel clean actually changes how you react and interact with other things. So we know that it's literally is doing something. And same thing with sex. We know that sex, and you even see it when Paul talks about it later on with, better not to be married because it distracts you from the work of the Lord, because we do know that's what happens. That's, I think the best argument for marriage between one man and one woman has to do with the biology of sex, like what it does to your brain. It rewires your mind, because we are physically beings who are created or evolved, however you want to say it, for mating with one person for the rest of your life. So your mind rewires. And you see that with studies in pornography, and how constantly seeing these different images and having orgasms rewires your mind and actually distorts your ability to have relationship the way that we were intended, or the way that we naturally would otherwise. So I think this isn't a big commentary on sex here, but I think it's important that was part of the command here was, hey, let's refrain from this, because we don't need for this moment, not for all time, not for whatever, but for this moment, we don't want our mind to be on our spouses. We don't want our mind to be on our physical needs, but rather we need our minds to be on God and ready to hear God.
Yeah, this isn't some grand statement. I have seen some commentaries say that sex is somehow something bad, or that the woman is the one at fault here, and that's not what it's trying to say. You can imagine some of the things I've read, but what it is trying to say is exactly what you were saying: is that I want you to give up these things that can either distract you. It's a huge distraction not to be clean. It's a huge distraction to have your mind on another person who, yes, you're in love with, you're married to. That's something you're supposed to have, but you're supposed to be focused more on God. So can you, for just this amount of time, give that thing up so that your heart and mind are devoted to thinking about God?
Yeah. One, just I have a funny anecdote. Then I have I want to tie this to fasting for a second too. Not for a long time, but I'm passionate about fasting. So when we later get to a real fast, like the Isaiah fast, it'll be fun. We talk about it. But the funny anecdote, I had a pastor once, the first time I heard this preached, was saying, imagine if you go to church, you're ready to worship, and the guy next to you just smells so bad. That's the only thing you could think of. I don't think that's what this passage is about. But it's funny, and the more I think about it afterwards, I'm like, well, that's not what this is about, but it does make sense. Like, it actually is distracting if me and Christian are in church and he just smells so bad that's all I could think about. That would be awful.
You're supposed to focus in that scenario.
But that's not what the scripture is about. But, I used to mock that, and now I'm like, even though it's not what it's about, it's still sort of what it's about. It is about focusing on God.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not completely wrong. But the fasting thing, that's another one of those physical yet spiritual things, right? We and what's fun is this should be something I think churches should be talking about all the time. So for a long time, people would make fun of religious people for fasting because, all you're doing is not eating. That doesn't do anything. God doesn't care if you're throwing a hunger strike. But now we know that when you fast, your body goes into ketosis. Your brain's actually operating at a higher capacity. So we know that by fasting, we're actually able to think clearer, which would then mean if you're fasting and praying to God, you're more clearly thinking about the words of God and able to understand him better. So there's actually just science behind why this has always been practiced in religion, not just Christianity, but fasting just kind of makes sense, it turns out. Not for 40 days. That doesn't make sense. But yeah, so I think same thing here with abstaining from sex. Like there's some things you could physically do that help your psychology, your mental state be ready to hear from God. And I think it's important to do those things physically for preparing for the spiritual need.
Yeah. As someone who recently started fasting every Wednesday after lunch, not for not wholly for spiritual reasons, some of which are for health reasons and concerns, it's given me a greater appreciation for people who can last a little longer. It's given me an appreciation for why it is important to be doing that in the first place. It's gotten my mind to think about things that I wouldn't be thinking about because, oh, it's time to eat. It's time to be focused on something else. So, yeah, it's an immensely rewarding experience. And I think that's one of the things God is attempting to do. Like this part specifically doesn't mention fasting, but I can see why you took it this way, because the whole part of fasting in a religious and spiritual sense is to get your mind right, to deny yourself something that, hey, you do require. It is impossible for human beings to go long without eating. We are designed in that way. We are shaped in that way, molded in that way to need to eat. So that makes perfect sense to me why God would say, hey, deny yourself here in these ways, even though specifically he doesn't mention fasting here. Once again, I see where you got that from.
Yeah. And just, it's fun because I don't want to come off as one of those. The more we study science, the more we'll see the Bible's right. It turns out the earth wasn't flat, right? Like, there are some things that we get from the Bible that we're not going to prove scientifically. And there are some things that the Bible imagery that the Bible might use that we're like, wait a minute, with correct scientific understanding, that imagery doesn't make sense. Well, that's not, the original audience didn't know that. So chill, right? So I'm not trying to say that the Bible's always going to be scientifically accurate, but I do think it's funny how the more we see these things that we're physically commanded to do that maybe don't make any sense, actually are doing something to our minds and our spirits that we are able to prove prepares us for something. Yeah, that's all. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. And I think in regards to the mountain itself, the mountain is not holy in and of itself. It is holy because God says it is. And there's no other person in existence who can make that designation for anything. Like, if I were to walk up the Sinai today, wherever the heck it is, I'm not going to suddenly burst into flames because it served its purpose at that point in time. But to this moment, for these people, at this specific time in history, it is holy because God said to, and because he's trying to teach them a lesson. Like, don't even touch it. If an animal even touches it, they're to die because they are an imperfect being touching something God has made holy, and only the people I tell, even an imperfect being like Moses, are allowed to go there. So do these things, put on clean clothes, abstain from sex, not because those things are bad inherently in and of themselves, but because I say not to do them. So can you do these small things? So when I'm about to introduce you to a lot of high concepts about morality and cultural context and everything and priestly laws, are you going to be able to do those things?
And I'll say, I'm trying to think. I'm going to say this here. There are times that I think, well, okay, so let me respond to something you said before I say this. One, I don't think it is just because God said so, but also I want to emphasize that any place can be a holy place. Mm-hmm. God might decide that right now he wants to speak to you, but you need to be in your office, or you need to be in your child's bedroom, or something that you're like, what, why? And this is like the Pentecostal in me coming out. But I feel like some of these spiritual tuggings we need to listen to. You might get to your child's room and it might be nothing, and you might just be a crazy person. That's fine. Pray like a crazy person. It's fine. Or you might go in there and start to pray, and then you'll see something in your daughter's room that God needed you to see so that you can speak a word to your daughter. There might be a reason for some of these spiritual tuggings. And I've experienced a lot of that myself, is why I say that. It's like where I'm like, God, why do I need to pray in my brother's room? And I'm like, oh man, I am glad. I am like beyond, like I couldn't use words to say how thankful I am in that moment that I went to my brother's room to pray. And it's not just because, there's something for my brother. Like, there's reason sometimes. There's a reason that God chose Sinai in the middle of the wilderness, not just for imagery, but there are reasons that God, this is the place that I need right now. Not for all time, but right now, this is a holy place. And I even remember, it was crazy. I think the time that this really stood out to me is at church camp. 5 days, like 2 sermons a day, basically. And I remember early in the week, someone talked about how there is no holy places. This sanctuary isn't holy. You could pray right where you are. And then by the end of the week, I remember there was someone said something when they were praying. I was like, I have to go to the altar. And I felt that. And I remember even questioning, like, I shouldn't go up there. There's no difference. I'm just doing it for a show. And I kept resisting. And then I finally was like, you know what? I'm going to go because I feel like it is special for some reason. And then someone came to pray with me at that altar. I don't want to drop names. Who didn't just pray, who stopped and asked me some questions about why am I praying? What do I feel about this? And, different things going on in my life. And it turns out that person now is a spiritual mentor to me who's been a mentor for 20 years. So in that moment, that place was holy because God in his sovereignty had a plan. And I had to be obedient for that plan to unfold. And I think that's what's happening here with the people of Israel. God has a plan for Sinai. He has a plan for them to be here in a specific moment that Will's going to tell you all about next episode. I set Will up. I'm sorry.
There you go.
But outside of that, I forgot what my other thing was, honestly. Could you remind me what you were saying before I got on a side tangent?
The site itself wasn't holy in and of itself. It's because God said it was. That's why, hey, do these specific things because I tell you to do them.
I'm sure we'll get there eventually.
Okay. Well, if you're good, we can go ahead and go to
let's go ahead. Everyone will just be just as irritated as I am that I couldn't think of it. Or glad that I didn't think of it. One of the two.
All right. Verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. I know you were saving some things for here.
I love this. So what you see is the people in preparation for the word of the Lord had to do something physical and something spiritual. They're preparing their mind, their body, and their soul. Love God with all of those things, right? They're preparing to hear God with those things. And how does God answer? Not with just some spiritual feeling in their heart, verbally with his voice, physically through lightning. Like God is showing himself psychologically, spiritually, and physically, body, mind, and soul. He was calling back to them. And the image of thunder is one of the absolute coolest in the Bible. And here is where it's like really exemplified why it's so freaking cool. Take yourself back to having no idea what the heck thunder is. And you think lightning and thunder might be separate. They happen at the same time. Sometimes there's thunder, but no lightning. And the idea is this thing where you see there is a physical aspect, but also a lot of people in their minds, there was something spiritual happening. The gods were angry. That's what the thunder was, right? Like the lightning was a physical consequence. The thunder was something that was spiritual, that we could hear, but we could not see. So, and it's just so cool. And just the imagery of that. I'm going to read a passage now.
Go for it.
From the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, Leland Ryken, James C. Wilhoit, and Trimper Longman III. Trimper Longman being a friend of the Whole Church podcast and all around great guy. It's like Pete Enns if Pete Enns was still kind of conservative. Kind of. All right. I love this. So the image of thunder in the Bible is based on a paradox. It is a force of nature that consistently images forth something beyond nature, namely the presence, power, and judgment of deity, invoking primary awe and dread. I just love like it's that paradox of something of nature that is also beyond nature. And when I think of how God is making himself known here, and when we see the 10 Commandments, yeah, there's physical and more than that, right? Like going through the 10 Commandments. We're not going to do that here. That's for Will. But, you have don't commit adultery, but you also have don't put others before God. So there's a psychological, physical, spiritualness in all of this. We can't disentangle. We can't be like, oh, as Christians, I'm going to feed my spirit and I'm going to completely deny my body. No, your body is part of your worship. Your soul, your mind, they're all part of your worship. And what does that look like? Here is where we see some great examples of like how those things are entangled and how we're interacting with the divine as full beings, not partial beings, but as full beings with a God who loves all of us, even all of my Silico cells.
Yeah. This whole thing is just so awe-inspiring. I mean, could you imagine being in that moment? And yet, you've lived through the plagues. You see God every day. It's the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire. But then this adds on to that. He's surrounded an entire mountain. The thunder and the lightning flash. The fire is like a kiln, like it's trying to change the shape of the mountain itself, like you would in a kiln. And then you hear the trumpet growing louder and louder. And Moses dares to speak as his role as priest, the intermediary between God and his people. And God answers. This small, insignificant human being, God answers him as he's displaying his power and might.
Yeah. And I also want to just all of the things seen and felt here. It's not just this other thing, but it's what God's wanting to do. God isn't just showing off. He's not just wanting to terraform the mountain, as some people translate that word. He's hoping to transform his people, the soul of those who hear his word. God's not just wanting to speak as lightning and thunder because, wow, God is awesome. He's wanting his impact on your life to be that of thunder. That's so significant that it just resounds through the entire rest of your story. I've recently, I try and think of the guy's name. It's like John McMillan or something. My favorite Christian music artist post-pandemic, I can't remember his name. I just know if I type in John on my Spotify, it'll pop up.
There you go.
But he has a song that's Rolling Thunder. The album name is Deep Magic. So it's a good album. But he's talking about how he steps into a room like roaring thunder and how everything that happens in the rest of his life will be in the shadow of his presence. It is just kind of this one moment of how God is going to resound through the rest of your life and just being prepared for that moment. That reminds me of the thing I was going to say earlier.
We did it.
You sometimes need to know what word you are looking for. So they are preparing for what is God going to set for his people. They know they're about to get their own land and they need their own politics. They need their own laws. They need their own religion. They need structure. They know what they're preparing for. And I think sometimes if there's a friend in your life and you're really concerned for them, I remember one time I had a friend who was struggling with their identity as a queer person, and they weren't sure what God thought about that, what the Bible thought about that. And I had never researched it at that time. And I remember I was going through 500 different books, be like, okay, what is good theology? What is bad theology? What are the different sides? And I could be like, hey, even if you don't agree with me, here's all the different sides of this. And I had all that work, and I had this scholarly thing put together that I was going to be able to present to them a paper. Here is a paper about your queerness. And then it hit me, that's not the word she needs. And I actually, after months of research and writing and typing up a paper, what was more effective, fasting for a week, isolating myself and praying and getting, God, how do you still love this person? And what does love look like? And instead of telling them about what is the right theology around this thing, just be like, hey, God loves you. And here's what his love looks like for you in this moment. And that being the message they needed to hear. So I think sometimes not coming up with your own plan and doing it your way, but rather preparing yourself physically, mentally, spiritually to hear from God in those same ways so that you can be a priest, a mediator of what God has to say. So, whether it's a friend, a daughter, a family member, whether it's for your own life, kind of being open to maybe God's message is different than what you think you're looking for, but being ready for God's word and to just simply mediate it. You don't have to, you don't have to come up with God's words for him. You could just be a mediator.
I just had two different conversations thrown at me, so I'll try and respond as best as possible.
ADHD people are great podcast guests.
Oh, yes. So great. But I knew the chaos that would happen when I invited you on, and I welcome it. So in regards to that last one, yeah, we can talk about sin all day long, about where someone is at in their life, what they're struggling with, and being like, hey, theologically, this is where you need to be. But there's also a person struggling there, and they need to be talked to. They need someone in their lives to say, hey, I am here for you, regardless of whatever decision you make, whether it's good or bad. I still love you in the same way that God still loves you, and his way he still loves me, despite the fact that I'm not exactly his best representative on this earth. So be with people in those moments. And taking time away from your distractions and just reflecting on God's word and just thinking about what he's doing, fasting, something like that is a perfect way to do that because it removes distractions. Now, your other point, unless you had something you wanted to say.
No.
Is I agree as well as like the purpose of this isn't only to display God's power to the people. The purpose is for them to see there needs to be a transformation of your hearts away from your sin into the people of God, this kingdom of priests. The only way that's going to happen is if you see that physical thing here, but you know, I am also telling you, change, be different, be better. And it doesn't happen without this showing up in their lives in a physical way and an emotional way and a spiritual way, like you brought up earlier. So just reflect on those things.
If this was systematic ecology, I would have a recommendation time. But since I don't, I'll recommend here. A book by John H. Walton and J. Harvey Walton, The Lost World of the Torah, Law as Covenant and Wisdom in Ancient Context. It's a great work, and I think it really helps you prepare, especially for the Ten Commandments, of seeing God's word isn't this like dogmatic, here are them rules, you do them rules, you're going to make it to heaven. But rather, the law is not how we think of law as Americans. How law worked in the ancient world was a lot more like what we think of as like wisdom literature. A little bit different, but read their work. They explain that really well. I think it's a really good tool for Exodus and Leviticus.
Do you know what I love about you, Joshua? Is that we are both well-read people, but you actually remember not only the content of the story, but the name of the book so that people, and the author's name too, so that people can go explore it. I've read some of these things and other things as well that I could introduce to these shows. I don't remember them well enough to be like, hey, go read this. And I'll think about it after the fact and say, man, I should have recommended this book. But you on the spot can just do it. And I love that about you.
It's easier with two people because I really only remembered like Lost World of Torah. And I couldn't remember the author or any of that. But while you were talking, I'm able to like Google it real quick because I know just enough of the words that I can find it.
Yeah, it is a lot easier with two people because you can just mute yourself and then just clickety clack away and look it up. I mean, I could do that. I can pause these recordings, but then, that takes time away. And then as well, it also creates audio issues for you to fix. And I'm like,
yeah, and I don't actually edit. I just kind of take the sound away and I'm like, all right, sounds good. Then I listen to it when it publishes. I'm like, man, he should get an editor.
Well, you ready to finish this one off?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. We'll go to verses 21 through 25 and we'll be done for the day. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord to look and many of them perish. Also that the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them.
He did good. Good job, Moses.
Yes. Oh, if there's anyone throughout the Pentateuch who does their job at keeping people alive as best as possible, it's Moses.
I mean, Miriam did okay, except for that one time.
Yeah, except for that one. But that's okay.
Yeah,
I mean, we all screw up at certain points.
Yeah. Yeah, not all of us are Jesus.
Yeah, kind of hard.
I can't even be Miriam. I mess up one time a day. I have a quota to fit,
Yeah, of course. But like when you look at the rest of the history of the Exodus and seeing how many times God comes close to the point of, I'm going to wipe these people out. And it would be the righteous thing to do. Moses is the one speaking against that, saying, don't do that, Lord. What would the Egyptians say? What would the people say if you wiped out your people for their sins? And yeah, it would be just, it would be righteous, but we're your people. Please watch over us and protect us, forgive us. And God was never going to wipe them out, but he needed someone like Moses around to voice these concerns for the people.
I'll say, aren't you glad that God changes and that he's not immutable? But for the record, that's actually something me and Christian agree on. We both think God is immutable. I just like to poke fun.
Just being contrarian.
Yeah. That was just for fun.
Yes. And this whole ordeal is like God reminding one more time, knowing the stubborn and forgetful hearts of his people, he warned Moses to remind them to follow the rules God had made in regards to not getting near to the mountain and for the priests to maintain their consecration. Well, Moses is gone. Well, maybe they decide they're going to do whatever they want. But if there's a reminder, hey, stay on task, they might keep it up.
I hesitate to say this because I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't think the author, and I don't think you need to understand the book. You don't need Jesus to understand Exodus. I will say that. I don't think the author had Jesus in mind. But I do think there's a truth to a lot of this language of don't even come near the mountain, saying that 3 times because it's that important, right? Don't touch it. You can't be in the place of God because he's so separate, so holy that it'll kill you for the imperfect to touch the perfect, right? I think a lot of that really is not intentionally from that author, but maybe intentional from God, that it's pointing to without a more perfect mediator, a more perfect king priest, we simply cannot engage with the divine. The law is not something we're capable of just doing perfectly. Being in God's presence is not something we're capable of on our own. Even being in the same land, God gave special superpowers to Moses to be able to do it. But ordinarily, we can't even touch the same place that God passes over. He doesn't even touch. He just passes over it. We can't even touch that land because that is how separate God is. And I think that's intentionally emphasized, not because we need to see God as this super transcendent thing. I think God is in and among all of us. But I think it's also important for us to realize that he is so separate, so holy, that we can't engage the divine at all without that mediator of Jesus. And what does it mean that Jesus mediated for us and atoned for us? Well, that'll be on our special episode on atonement theories. But I think we do agree that you need Jesus to mediate with the divine.
And there are, in fact, at least one episode I recall of Dummy for Theology where you wrestle with that concept.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Yes.
I think it's better when Trip Fuller comes on Whole Church and explains it because he's smarter than me.
Go to that one as well. Even as I disagree completely with his conclusions, he still knows his stuff.
He explains it really well.
Yes.
So that you can disagree better.
As well.
I love Trip.
I do love Trip as well.
I don't know. I agree with him that I don't believe in substitutionary atonement, but I don't know what I like better. So
that's fair.
Yeah.
Once again, as the good Reverend Justin Coleman said, you don't need to pass a theology quiz in order to get into heaven.
Thank God.
Amen.
Yeah.
Also on systematic ecology.
I love that guy. Justin Coleman, VIP.
Yes.
MVP. One of those.
Well,
both.
Well, now that we've talked about almost every single show on the network, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think the Bible After Hours is a pretty good... I like what he's doing with the Psalms right now. Hopefully they talk about Mount Sinai soon. I think My Seminary Life at some point has... Oh, we already mentioned My Seminary Life, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's left? You mentioned why I don't like...
Yeah. The homily, Pastor Will, you want to hear him prepare before he actually shows up on the show? Listen to the homily.
The Clydes are partial members, so listen to half of their episode if you want.
If you need some more Pangalangan in your life, go for it.
I don't know. Let's listen for Taylor.
That poor man.
I love Taylor.
I've never met the man, but I feel for him.
Well, I will tell you, the main thing you need to know about Taylor Clyde, he lost killer buddies against me.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that's all. But you don't need to know anything else.
That's the true measure of
I have defeated him.
In glorious combat. You can die and go to Silvercore now.
I think that's my version of Valhalla. If I die playing killer buddies, I'm just going to go. It's like, well, I thought it was heaven, but I guess I could settle.
Okay, yeah. Speaking of Star Trek as well, I've been watching some DS9 on the Pluto channel. It's been so good.
Yeah. We're gonna have that episode on systematic ecology soon too. Do we have to plug everything twice?
I mean,
please wrap this up.
No, I know. There's one show I want to really talk about, but it's not ready to air yet, and I don't know when that person is going to start it. But I'm so ready for it.
Yeah, there's an episode I plan on doing with him on this possible show as well.
Yes. Yeah. I have also talked to this person about the movie I would like to do with him.
This is going to be fun. Whoever or whatever we may be talking about. I hope he's listening.
That decides to come out. I do too. All right. Yeah. Let's wrap this up. So, Joshua, thank you for being here today. Thank you for never keeping us on task, for always go chasing every rabbit you found, even when the rabbit wasn't real. You looked after it and you chased it. And I appreciate it.
Listen, I want no stone left unturned because it might just be the one covering the grave.
There you go. Now, see, could you imagine if I had done this episode by myself? This would have been at most 20, 30 minutes. Instead, we've gone over an hour.
Perfect.
And we faced perils along the way. Listeners, you couldn't see, but there was a giant cat kaiju that stepped in and caused some audio issues.
That was the Yule Cat.
Yule Cat. Check out Systematic Ecology Friday Night Frights, where I and Joe Day talk about the Yule Cat.
That's a YouTube exclusive.
Yes.
More plugs.
We can keep going. Let's stop. Okay.
Please,
guys.
Please.
Thank you for everything that you do. Please get a chance, leave a 5-star review in your podcasting platform of choice. Help us with the ratings there to find more people. I'd love to reach them. If you're interested in my own fiction writing, you can find my works at StuffingWritersGuild.com or on Amazon by searching for the name MC Ashley. If you're all interested in some further solid studies into the Bible and its teachings, you can check out the other members of the Annisal Ministries podcasting network. You can contact me at letnothingmoviepodcast@gmail.com. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Joshua Knoll for the editing that he does and for the music he has to the podcast.
Sounds like
I will
a loser.
allow him one more time. I will allow him one more time to plug himself before we end.
Dummy for Theology, Logical Fallacies. It's a fun time, and the Whole Church podcast is about to start up a series of What's Next. So we'll be talking about what's next after your call to ministry, after salvation, after deconstruction, marriage, divorce, a lot of different things of how Christians should handle things after they happen instead of, that's all.
Perfect. And with all that in mind, God bless you in accordance to his will and not mine. And allow me one more time to remind you, let nothing move you. Hey guys, are you interested in podcasting but don't know where to go? Well, check out Zencaster.com and go ahead and make an account there and use special promo code Let Nothing Move You, all caps. That way you can get 30% off of your next deal to go ahead and set things up so you can figure out how to edit stuff using Zencaster.com to host your stuff, to get things done there. So check out Zencaster.com, use special promo code Let Nothing Move You. All right, see ya.